Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. The site for this layout design is a rectangular room, a little less than 20 feet long and a little under 14 feet wide. Entry is via an opening in the corner, and there is a door leading outside to a patio at the other end of the room. This side door is rather awkwardly placed, and I can't think why it's built to hang in this direction. It would make much more sense if the house was built with it facing the other way. I can only imagine it was a later addition put in by someone who didn't really know much about home design. And the client tells me that he has seriously considered rehanging the door the other way even before he decided to use this room for a model railroad. At one end of the room we have a large picture window, but the client said he was perfectly okay with blocking that. He didn't need to get access to it. Now the client works in HO scale, so it's, I guess, an average size space. He only plans on running 4-axle diesels and small to medium steam locomotives, and he's okay with shortened passenger cars. So that means that we can use a much sharper radius than if you wanted to run big steam and full-length passenger cars. Thus I suggested that we work on a minimum 2-foot radius curve, as those will take up a lot less space than bigger curves. Now this site plan is almost correct. There is in fact another light switch and a thermostat in this corner which are not shown yet, but they will appear on a later drawing. And also at this stage I didn't know quite how far the light switch was from the corner. I figured that was about right based on the photograph that he sent me, but I wanted to make sure, which is why there's a question mark there. Okay, here is the drawing with the light switch and thermostat shown in this corner. As always, once I've got the site plan accurate, the first thing I do is play around with different footprints just to figure out the most efficient use of the space. Here is the first plan I drew. All these plans are based on a folded dog bone with 2 end loops and the longest possible main line between them, and in most cases we end up using the south wall for a branch line. The next design attempts to get a slightly longer peninsula by removing the turn back curve from this corner and putting it in the other corner instead. It doesn't gain us a lot more space, but it does make the access in this area and the drop flap a lot easier. And on both of these plans I've also shown an alternative entry point, just in case you want to come into the branch line from the opposite direction. Here's the third plan. Basically it's the same as the previous one, but with the main line flipped end for end. And here is another variation of that. What I've tried to do here is elongate the peninsula as much as possible. And to do that, it has to move further south, which means we can no longer use the south wall for anything, unless we pinch the aisle width as well. And at about the time that I drew this, the client asked me about the possibility of a double deck design. And this one works well for that because we could put an elongated helix in this corner where it's pretty much out of the way. We just don't get to use this corner on the lower deck, but we can still go over it on the upper deck. And at this end I've shown 2 alternative benchwork alignments. Now the client wrote back and said that he liked this version with the elongated helix in the corner, but he wanted to maintain the use of the south wall for a branch line. So we ended up revising the footprint of this one, and this is what the client decided he liked. The biggest disadvantage with this is a rather cramped area leading out onto the patio, but it's only the client by himself. He doesn't have a family or anything. He lost his wife a few years ago, so it's just himself now. So it's not like there's going to be a lot of traffic through here. Anyway, the client was okay with this area and asked me to proceed with this footprint and see what I could come up with. So I actually drew 2 plans with this footprint. This plan is for a single deck railroad, just running the main line all the way around the edge with a branch line to a harbour. And here is the upper deck of a possible double deck layout. It's virtually the same usage of the space, but the operating plan is completely different. If we go back to the previous one, what we have is a completely through line with hidden staging in the back, and most trains will run through the scene from staging to staging. On this version, the yard becomes a terminal yard at one end of a short line, with their main line running around the upper deck, down the helix, and then repeating itself on the lower deck to either another yard or more lightly visible staging underneath this one. And the continuous run is now representing an interchange with another railroad, but it does still allow him to run continuously if he wants to. I never developed the lower deck fully, but here is the main line route, and we can see there is a possibility of another connection for another continuous loop on the lower level. And there'll be no railroad along the south wall on the lower deck. That will be the upper deck only, and I've suggested a display cabinet underneath it. Now the client wrote back and said he really liked the idea of the double deck. He wasn't quite sure what the lower level was going to look like, but he felt that it was possibly up to the challenge of building a double decker, even though he'd never done one before. Although we did have some more discussion, and then he eventually decided that it might be more railroad than he really wanted to build and maintain. So he went back to the single deck railroad, and I think that was the right choice. So here is the next version of the plan, and you may notice that I have removed the wide benchwork in this corner. I've cut it back, lengthened the aisle by a few feet. Not only does that greatly improve the route to the outside patio, but it allows us to straighten out this small town, and it fits a lot better. We are a little bit cramped across this dimension, and we ended up dropping the harbour branch down to a 22-inch radius from a 24. But since he's only ever going to run a 4-axle diesel and 40-foot freight cars, and the curve is visible from the inside only, it's going to look fine. After I sent off this version, the client decided that this was about as much layout as he wanted, so he asked me to finish working on this design. Here is the next version I drew, and here we've got all the track connected up with proper turnouts instead of just approximating them. And on this version you can see that I've left the colours on. I do all my track planning with the colours turned on. It helps me to visualise it better. Straight track is in black, circular curves are in red, and easements are in green. I find it a lot easier to work this way. And sometimes I also send off plans to the client with the colours turned on, just to give him a better idea. Now in this version, the track is almost in its final form, although the industrial area in this corner is still just a placeholder. That changed quite a lot. Here I've started to flesh in a few details, figure out what each track is going to be used for, put a few buildings in. I've shown 2 local passenger stations, because the client did think that he might want to run a passenger train. Now something that he asked me for earlier on is some switching puzzles, and he sent me one from a model railroader, which I suggested he didn't go for because it was an absolute nightmare. I suggested instead of an outright puzzle we went with a few problem spurs. So for example, in this industrial area there's one kickback spur, which means that to drop a car here, the operator has to think ahead, get it on the opposite end of the locomotive before he leaves the yard, and also make sure that one of these 2 tracks down here is free. And since his original request was for multiple switching puzzles, I've taken the opportunity to put spurs facing both directions at all 3 main switching locations. And the client decided that yes, that was probably about the right amount of puzzle switching. You certainly don't want it to become tedious. Here I have filled in the majority of the industries. As we can see, the north side of the room is all built up, although there's a certain amount of green areas between the industries. I reduced the number of spurs in this switching location because it was a little bit cramped otherwise. I also swapped the pulpwood spur to the other side of the main line. Firstly, it meant that I had more room for a high view blocking ridge down the middle of the peninsula, which the client said he preferred to a double-sided backdrop. And also, by putting it on the outside, the necessary driveway can be assumed to be in the aisle, so we're not actually allocating layout space for it. Anyway, here is the layout design finished. You can see here that I have the high ridge down the middle of the peninsula, and I forked it at the end because I wanted to get a little bit of a ridge between the harbour and the trestle, because these two valleys are going to go below the level of the water in the harbour. So I needed to make sure that it didn't look silly. I added an additional water feature in this corner, although this one is assumed to be the same body of water as the harbour, so it'll be the same length, basically just about an inch below track level. Anyway, I think that's about all there is to say about this layout design. Here is a clean version of the design. Please feel free to pause it if you want a longer look. So I'm just going to sign off here. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, found it useful or interesting or both, and I hope to see you back next week. Not quite sure what next week's video is going to be, but I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.